grieving for her daughter who is, in effect, dead. Now, that needs a little bit of explanation, perhaps. Why doesn't Demeter simply go to Tartaros to see Persephone? The answer to that is that Olympians can't, or at least don't, go to Tartaros. Hades is an exception because in the triple division he was given Tartaros as his domain, so he for the most part stays there and rules over Tartaros. Hermes is the only real exception to this rule. Hermes is a god we'll talk about in a later lecture. He's the messenger of the gods, among other things, but he's also the god who conducts the souls of dead humans to their new abode in Tartaros. So Hermes can cross into Tartaros and come back out again. But aside from that, Olympians normally cannot go to Tartaros. Persephone is there only because Hades has bodily taken her there as his bride. So the assumption that Demeter makes when she hears where Persephone is, Helios, the god of the sun, tells Demeter where Persephone is because from his vantage point in the sky, he's seen her abduction. Demeter's assumption is that Persephone is gone, is lost. And Demeter's reaction is very much like a human being's reaction at the death of a loved one. She even goes through some gestures, tearing her robe and so forth, that would normally be gestures a human being would do while grieving for the death of a loved one. So in Demeter's reaction to Persephone's disappearance, we have the only time that we see a god or goddess in effect mourning the death of another god or goddess. So Demeter has lost her daughter to marriage, and she's lost her daughter to at least the land of death, if not death itself. This underlines a symbolic connection that we see in a great deal of Greek literature between marriage and death. In part, that's probably because those are two great transition periods in life. Also, more grimly, it's probably a quite factual connection. A great many women died because they married. They died in childbirth. Infant mortality was high. Maternal mortality was very high. As far as we know, it's hard to tell. There are no records, but it seems that maternal mortality would have been very high. A girl who was married at 14 and who had a baby a year would quite likely die in one of those childbirths fairly early on in her life. And one way we know this is that we do have records of men marrying 2 or 3 or even more wives as they lived a more normal lifespan. Normal by our terms, that is. Now, the Homeric hymn not only reflects marriage practices and reminds us of the reality of death for humans, it also gives us a picture of the gods' attitude toward and relationship with humans. As we've talked about a little bit before, humans are useful to the gods, but we're not objects of affection. We see this in the hymn to Demeter when Zeus strikes the compromise so Demeter can have Persephone back for part of the year to keep Demeter from starving the humans to death. That sounds like Zeus is concerned for humans, is worried about us, feels pity for us. Not at all. The hymn says very clearly that Demeter would have killed off the race of human beings and deprived the Olympians of the honor of sacrifices if Zeus had not interfered. What Zeus is concerned with is that he and the other gods will no longer receive honor through sacrifice if the humans die. He doesn't care about the humans in and of themselves. He cares about his own honor through sacrifices that humans make to him. Now, the Homeric hymn to Demeter really consists of 2 interlocked or intertwined stories. The story of Persephone's abduction and return to her mother, or at least partial return to her mother, is the main story, the framing story. But inside that story, as I already mentioned, there's an account of Demeter visiting the town of Eleusis, a town near Athens, and the story of what she does while she's there. This second story is no less important in the Homeric hymn, though it is sandwiched in the middle between the disappearance of Persephone and the return of Persephone. We have this other story, the story of Demeter's visit to Eleusis. In this second narrative framework of the Homeric hymn, Demeter goes to Eleusis and visits the queen there, Metanera, queen of Eleusis. There's also a king of Eleusis, but he figures very little in the story. Demeter's interaction is with the queen's daughters, and the queen's baby son. When Demeter wanders to Eleusis, she's disguised as an old woman, a human being. And while she's sitting by a well, she meets the 4 daughters of Queen Metanera. These daughters are teenagers. They're presented as being young women about old enough to get married, so that means they're teenagers. They tell Demeter that they have a baby brother, and Demeter volunteers to be the nanny for the baby brother. Now, Demophon, that's the baby boy's name, is described as a late-born and much-desired son. The implication is that his mother had had these 4 daughters, who are now teenagers, had probably almost given up on ever having another child, and then finally has the baby boy, who in a patriarchal society is so crucially important. In other words, this would be a more than normally cherished son. Metanera is probably near the end of her childbearing years at this point. If Demophon dies, there's not likely to be a baby brother to replace him. In a culture where infant mortality is very high, an old woman who has experience caring for babies, and that's how Demeter presents herself, as an experienced nanny, would be an invaluable addition to a family circle because she knows what to do. She has experience. She's seen babies through childhood illnesses. She can take care of him. And Metanera says to Demeter when she hires her as a nanny, if you nourish him and raise him up to adulthood, I will give you great gifts and great honor. We tend to take it so much for granted that a baby once born is going to grow up to adulthood. We see it as an inversion of the natural order if the baby does not reach adulthood. In this culture, it's a very tenuous thing. Having a baby is just the beginning of it. You cannot assume that he'll live to maturity. So Demeter is hired to take care of this remarkably precious, late-born, and much-desired child. She, however, has another agenda. She sets out to make baby Demophon immortal. She does this by anointing him with ambrosia and by putting him in the fireplace, in the fire, every night. The ambrosia apparently keeps him from burning. Metanera comes in one night, observes what Demeter is doing, and reacts in an understandable way as a human mother. She is absolutely horrified because what she sees is a crazed old woman burning her baby in the fireplace. Demeter's reaction to Metanera's horror is to grow angry. Demeter becomes very angry, scolds Metanera, and says that now Demophon will not become immortal. And it's after that that Demeter causes the famine, and Zeus strikes the bargain by which she gets Persephone back. Now, the Homeric hymn does not recount Demophon's fate after this encounter with Demeter, but other authors, including Apollodorus, tell us that he died. That when Demeter lost interest in him, stopped trying to make him immortal, the upshot was he died. So through this encounter with Demeter, the family loses their son. Demophon probably dies. The Homeric hymn hints at that. It says when Metanera interferes, Demeter tosses the baby Demophon down on the ground. His sisters run over to try to comfort him, but he won't be comforted because he's used now to an immortal nurse, and mortal ones do him no good. So the hymn seems to hint at a short life for Demophon. Like the surrounding story of Persephone, the Demophon episode offers a window into the nature of the gods it describes and the society that created them. First of all, Demeter seems to be using Demophon as a Persephone substitute. She seems to be trying to provide a substitute child for herself. This is a pause in her search for Persephone. She's going to try to get herself another child instead. And in this context, I think it's noteworthy and important that she picks a male child. First of all, we can see this as Demeter attempting to repeat the pattern that we saw with Gaia and Rhea before her, gaining an immortal son that she's going to bring up to be her helper. Perhaps she's thinking in terms of when he grows up, she'll take her vengeance then on Zeus for depriving her of Persephone. Now, of course, it doesn't work, but that may be the motivation for trying to raise up an immortal son. Secondly, and this is a point my students very frequently see as the crucial point here, a male child won't be taken away from her through marriage. Why does she pick a male substitute for Persephone rather than getting a baby girl? The child stays with his mother. But Demeter's attempt to immortalize Demophon does not work. And that, of course, is consistent with the picture we talked about in Theogony. Once Zeus is in power, the order of the universe is fixed. It's not going to be possible now for a goddess, no matter how powerful, to bring up a male child who will help her overthrow her brother, in this case, the child's father, usually. By trying to immortalize a human child, Demeter may also be attempting to redress the balance between herself and Hades. What I mean by that is that Hades has taken an entity, a being, that should not belong to him. He's taken Persephone, who ought to be immortal. Perhaps Demeter is in effect saying, all right, you took one of mine, I will take one of yours. Hades is ruler over all the human souls who have ever died, which means, in effect, all the human souls who ever have or ever will live. One of Hades' titles is the Lord of all, or the receiver of all. He's also described as a very rich god. And so when Demeter tries to immortalize Demophon, she is in effect taking away from Hades a being that ought, in the normal run of things, to belong to Hades. Again, the next point I want to make about the Demophon episode is that, again, it shows us the gods' unconcern with human emotion and their tendency to see humans as useful rather than as proper objects for affection. Demeter does not seem to love Demophon. As I already said, when she replies to Metanera's interference, when she grows angry at Metanera, she throws Demophon to the ground. She loses all interest in him. She doesn't even look at him after that, as far as we can tell from the text. More importantly, perhaps, it doesn't seem even to cross Demeter's mind that she, if she succeeds in immortalizing Demophon, she will be inflicting precisely the same kind of anguish on Metanera as Hades and Zeus inflicted on her, on Demeter. She's stealing someone else's baby. She's taking him permanently away from his mother. It does not even seem to cross her mind that she ought to have empathy for Metanera, that she ought to understand Metanera's grief if Metanera loses her child. That doesn't enter the picture. And another point that I want to make here is that Demeter says to Metanera, in effect, that this is all her own fault. Demeter says to Metanera, when Metanera interferes, men are too foolish to know ahead of time the measure of good and evil which is yet to come. You too were greatly blinded by your foolishness. The relentless water of the Styx by which gods swear be my witness. Immortal and ageless forever would I have made your dear son, but now it is not possible for him to escape the fate of death. So it's Metanera's fault. And Demeter doesn't seem to even entertain the idea that a human mother might prefer to keep her child with her rather than